He had this plan that he was going to kill everybody but my mom, so her parents and me and my sister, because then she'd know what it was like to be alone.
This episode of Wildlife Podcast contains adult themes and subjects that may not be suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised. The cycle of abuse is characterized by four main phases. First is known as the tension-building phase. This phase is typically defined by the abuser's frustration with their lack of control over outside stressors, such as work or family. The victim becomes hyper-aware of the abuser's feelings at this time and will begin to feel anxious knowing that the abuse is coming. Second, the abuse phase. This phase can take on many forms, from sexual abuse, physical, emotional abuse, to name-calling and insults. The abuse phase is then followed by the honeymoon phase, where the abuser apologizes, showering the victim with kindness, gifts, and assurance that the abuse will not continue, that they feel shame for what they have done, or they will completely ignore the abuse they've just committed. And finally, the fourth phase. Calm, where the abuser and the victim have both agreed to move on past the incidents of abuse. However, like most things in life, this cycle is not sustainable. The cracks will begin to show, and whether by the abuser or the victim's hand, the cycle will come to an end. And when it does, the outcome can be life-altering. And when the abuser loses control, they will stop at nothing to regain that control. Everyone you meet has a story. This is Samantha's.
My name is Samantha Smith, and I am from Port Townsend, Washington. So it's a small place in the Pacific Northwest. It's a rural place, but it's on the coast, and it's in a Victorian area. So you kind of grew up with this mix of really old buildings, right, and they're big and they're pretty, and also poverty and drug use and things that are kind of unique to small towns. Everybody knows everybody, and when it comes to traumatic events in a small town, everybody knows everything. And so that kind of had an impact on my childhood, and you really can't, you just can't do anything without somebody knowing. Can't go downtown and make mischief without your mom somehow finding out because your second cousin saw you. In my younger years, I spent a lot of time doing volunteer work, especially through 4-H. I was in 4-H for 13 years. I was always trying to be busy. And as I got older, a big part of being busy was actually to avoid being at home. So the goal was to be out of the house. So that meant I was working. I had a job starting at 13 and it just didn't end. I just kept finding work. I did 4-H in so many capacities. I sat on state boards and all that because it gets you out of the house for weekends at a time. It was a lot of anxiety, though. There's a lot of anxiety in my childhood, and that's permeated my adulthood. So I was actually born in Utah. When I talk about it, the story definitely starts well before me, in that my mom married my dad after 2 dates because she was part of the Mormon faith. She was LDS, and there was this belief that if you don't get married young, there's something wrong with you. And she had made it to, I think, 23 and still wasn't married, and all of her friends were. And so when this guy, who she had okay dates with, asked her to marry him, she said yes. And it didn't exactly go well from there. Like on their honeymoon, the first night they went to California, and she said something upsetting to him. So he left the hotel room and told her to find her own way home, and left her without money in a city she'd never been in. She called her parents, but after a few hours he came back and she forgave him, and that kind of started a cycle. He never lashed out at me or my little sister. It was very targeted towards my mom and to animals, actually. And so he would do things in front of us, especially me because I'm older. At one point, he tried to, light her on fire with hairspray, but it wasn't an aerosol can. It was a pump spray. And so he kept trying, but he couldn't figure out why it wouldn't light on fire. So things like that where it's almost comical, but then looking at it in context, it's horrifying. My mom wasn't allowed to cook. She wasn't allowed to do this. She wasn't allowed to do that. And I got to see and hear a lot of yelling and violence that you shouldn't see at a young age. And my mom kind of drew the line when my dad took a knife and he sliced her on the thigh. And she decided that was it. She's done. She can be abused in other ways, but that was it. She took us. She went from Utah back home to Washington, started divorce proceedings. There was a custody agreement. We still went to Utah for a year or two. And what ended up happening is my dad decided somewhere along the way, all of this was my mom's dad's fault. My favorite memory in the shop, my papa he had these shelves of model cars, toy cars, Matchbox cars. Some were incredibly old, some were newer. I mean, he was fastidious. The whole shop, despite being a tow shop and it smelled like grease and it should have been dirty all the time, he cleaned it all the time. And even though it was already clean, he would let me and my sister take little wipes and we'd clean every single car because we wanted to help. He'd sit behind his desk and smile and talk to us. And it was just it was comforting. It was very loving, giving us a way to feel involved and a way to feel important. And I can see now as an adult that the way he was smiling was a knowing grandpa smile. But at the time, you just look and he's so proud of me for my cleaning and I'm doing great. And I remember that very well. My dad thought the reason my mom left was because of my grandpa. And that wasn't the case. It was his own abusive choices. And so when he kind of worked himself into a fit and he decided that the best course of action was to put a bunch of firearms in his car and drive from central Utah all the way to northern Washington. And we're talking, you can see Canada, northern Washington. And he had this plan that he was going to kill everybody but my mom, so her parents and me and my sister, because then she'd know what it was like to be alone. And she hadn't taken us away. We were still visiting him, but it was for him is this loss of control. And so he tried to find us and he couldn't, my sister, my Nana and I, because he was told kind of this vague description of where we lived, but he didn't realize that there were two communities with the same name. So he was in the wrong one and he kept getting lost and couldn't find us. So he went to my papa's place of business, which was a towing yard. He ran a towing company. It's really well known around town. So at the time my dad entered the office of the tow yard, my papa was on the phone with a customer and he told the woman to call 911 and he kind of left the line open, asked what was going on. And my dad said, "You'll never laugh at me again." And he shot him 25 times. He had 2 handguns that he was using 9mm. He turned to the drivers and asked if they wanted to live. They said yes, and so he had them duct tape each other. And then he called my mom, and he told her it was done. He told her where he was, what he had done, that she was going to regret her choices. And so she called 911 and said, "Can you confirm to me what's going on?" And all they could tell her was, "There's a deputy at the shop." And I actually learned that they still use those phone calls, the transcripts from dispatch in training for new dispatchers. When the police showed up, he dropped his guns really easy, said, "It's done. He's dead now." And he was taken into custody. He was being charged with first-degree murder, two counts of first-degree kidnapping, and 2 counts of assault. And that came from the drivers who I grew up being around. I grew up hanging around that shop. It's just crazy when I realized who the drivers were. And unfortunately, looking at their lives further on it was just not good. It was a huge downhill spiral from there for both of them. A lot of drugs for one of them. The other one stopped taking care of himself and he just shut off, kind of became a recluse. Kept working but didn't do much of anything else, and just kind of, he's around still. He's just this slow letdown, and the other is more of the spiral. Gotten heavily back into drugs. He was very broken. They both watched someone get shot who they respected get shot 25 times. When people die, they have that tendency to go, oh, they were great, or that was the sweetest man. I truly and wholeheartedly believe it. When he passed in the funeral, they blocked miles of a highway because there were so many logging trucks, military vehicles, normal vehicles as part of this procession. There were signs all across town in like all the reader boards for different businesses. You know, Skip will miss you. He was the kind of person that when people needed to be towed out of a situation, they needed towed and they couldn't afford it, he drove my Nana nuts because he'd have them pay in food or favor later. He was really big on bartering, but didn't actually stand there and say, well, you have to do something. He'd do it anyway. He believed that you're supposed to help people and they'll help you back. Eventually, things will line up. Anytime people, like as an adult, my mechanic that I go see, I mentioned something in passing and he goes, wait, are you related to Skip? And I was like, yeah, that's my grandpa. And he goes, oh, he taught me everything I know. He's a great guy. I wouldn't have gotten my start without him. And you just hear that from all kinds of people growing up. You're Skip's granddaughter. Yes, I am. And then they'll tell me all these stories. And he was just delightful. But what happened at trial was kind of this unraveling of his stories. He was pushing that he's mentally ill, but the court-appointed psychiatrist and his own psychiatrist could not say what was wrong with him. They went up and said, pretty much, we don't know. We cannot tell you what's wrong with him. We can't give you a defense of mental illness because we can't figure out what it is. Not that he was an enigma, there just was not a mental illness driving his behavior. He was pushing all of these defenses. He changed his plea from not guilty to guilty when his dad, very religious, came up and said, you're already excommunicated from the church, but I will excommunicate you as my son if you do not plead guilty. You own up to what you did, be a man. That made my dad change his mind. Anything else, it wasn't this overwhelming evidence. It was not him being caught red-handed. It was this threat from his dad. And he was sentenced to 84 and a half years. There was a quote by the judge that has really stuck, and it really covers the impact, not on my dad, but also on me and my sister. He said, because of his acts, he'll never have his daughters again. He won't see their t-ball games, won't be able to take them to Disney World or Disneyland, won't be able to attend their high school graduation or walk them down the aisle. He won't be able to hold his grandchildren. That is his punishment, not what I do. And so I found that quote in an article when I was maybe 10 or 11, and that really hit hard. It wasn't just, I'll never talk to him again. It was, oh my God, he'll never be back. He'll never be at my wedding. He won't be there if I have kids. All of this stuff will continue to happen without him. And even worse to me, it'll happen without my papa. As a kid, I only liked and trusted two men, and in one day I lost both of them. It set this tone for a lot of my life, and you can just see there's just this overwhelming cycle that when you're in it, you don't see it, but when you're out or in a class and they talk about it, you go, oh my God, it's here. We had it's a restraining order, but I think it's actually considered no contact order that was active until my sister and I turned 18. I kind of expected something when I turned 18, but nothing happened. And then in 2020, my mom got this letter from the Utah State Penitentiary, and my sister and I saw it at the P.O. box, and we're like, well, we can't open it, but somebody has to open it. Mom, open it. As soon as she got home from work, we're like, open this. Because we were both visiting home, and when we found it, and she opened it, and it's this 6-page double-sided letter saying some things along the lines of, God has forgiven me. I want to apologize to you for being selfish. Went on to explain how he's changed in prison. He knows he's excommunicated from the church, but he knows that he's right with God, and she didn't deserve what he put her through, and he's had lots of time to think. At the end, he said, this is a letter. You get to decide if the girls ever see it. If you tell them, and then it's their choice to reach out. So it feels very manipulative. He put it to my mom to say whether or not we got his contact information, whether or not we saw the letter. And that puts her in the spot where she has to think, well, do I hide it, or do I tell them that their dad wants to talk to them? And because we were there and we read the letter, we know. And I have actually spent almost 2 years wondering if I should write. It sounds crazy, but at least once a week I think about, well, what if I write and send that letter? And there are all these things that make you stop. Well, is that a betrayal to my grandparents? Is that betraying my mom? That is the only contact we've had almost 17 years later. It's very selfish, I feel, for me to say this, but he ruined so much of my childhood. He took away experiences. He took away the two people I loved the most. He ruined my Nana's life at that point. She was never, ever the same. He ruined my mother's trust in anything. And it was just this introduction to trauma. My mom, years later, decided to get remarried, and she married somebody who is a strong-arm felon, which means that the crime he committed, he did without weapons, which meant that his arms basically were considered weapons. It's ridiculous. It means if he got pulled over, they had to have 2 cop cars because he himself is armed and dangerous just by existing. He was physically abusive. He was sexually abusive. He was a meth addict. At one point, he wore a loincloth while high on meth and skulked around the house, and he's about 6'4" and a bodybuilder. So I spent several years of my life doing anything I could to stay away from home. That led to a lot of poor choices on my end. I nearly moved in with a boyfriend at 16 because I didn't want to be home, because it was dangerous to be home. You could have this man who could do anything at any point. And my mom kind of had her head in the sand. And when I was in high school, he got very, very drunk. He'd crashed cars before, but this time he got his truck stuck somewhere. And because he was drunk and on probation, they couldn't call the police. So they were trying to do all of this quietly. My mom put him in her car, tried to drive him home, and he got aggressive and tried to punch through the window of her car. Then he hit her in the face. She tried to go inside. He knocked her down, slammed her in the face, and seriously damaged her cheek. So that's when she called the cops and decided enough was enough. He was arrested, and she never let him come back after that. But what stuck out to me a lot was it took 4 years for her to finalize their divorce. And everybody who talked about it always pushed and wanted to know, why is it taking so long? And they get very rude and say, why? I don't know why she didn't leave him before. Why isn't she divorcing him yet? And there are a few people I took aside and go, do you know what happened the last time she divorced someone? The last time she divorced someone, her dad died. Then people kind of backed off. I can understand why it took her so long. And I thought, I have all this information about trauma. I've grown up in therapy. I know what abusive men can do. I know what happens when they feel cornered, when they feel like they've lost everything. They're dangerous. I took that knowledge with me to college and walked face first into somebody who was massively abusive. It was this slow and creeping cycle. It really showed there's not one day where an abuser decides, I'm going to hit you today. I'm going to isolate you from your family. It's slow and steady. And then one day you're going, oh my God, my family won't even talk to me because I keep telling them that I'm not allowed. And I found myself being physically abused. I found my cat was being kicked around, which was horrifying. I was being sexually abused. I was embarrassed, and all I could think for a while was, oh my God, I'm doing the exact same thing my mother did. People have died because of this in my life, and I still didn't figure it out, which didn't prompt me to leave. It prompted me to hide it, because no one wants to admit that they made the same mistakes. What scared me and made me do something and go to a survivor center was when I was being choked. I could see my lips turning blue in a mirror, and I went, he's going to have to explain to the EMTs why I'm passed out. That's what I was worried about. Not that I could die, but oh my God, he's going to have to explain to the EMTs, and I'm going to have to deal with him having to explain to the EMTs. And that kind of clicked that I had become so used to this sort of violence in my life. I was willing to let it keep going because that's just the way it is. I ended up getting a restraining order. I left the state. That was all incredibly horrible. It's really hard to imagine a day where something doesn't trigger me, where someone doesn't say something or I don't see something that makes me go, oh my God, and it reminds me of my dad or my papa, my ex or my ex-stepdad. There's always something there, and what I've learned is that it's going to have an impact on me. There's nothing I can do to stop that. Nothing will change what's happened. The answer isn't to just say, oh, I'm not going to let it bother me and go about my life ignoring all of these emotions. What I can do is recognize what's happening. Why is it upsetting to me? Why did that part of the movie make me turn away and want to cry? It's really hard to reflect on things like that, especially when a lot of that trauma is coming from childhood and from things I may not remember, but they're feelings that I know. I know the feelings, even if I can't picture where they're coming from. A big thing I embrace is the idea of advocacy and outreach and support, because if no one ever talks about their trauma and what happened to them, it remains this dark secret and people don't seek help. It's horrible, the things my family's gone through, the things I've gone through. My mom was part of an investigation discovery episode, actually, and she didn't get paid for it. And when people asked why she did it, she goes, so nobody does this again. So that somebody out there, even if it's only one person, sees or hears one of us say something and goes, I can leave and get help before somebody gets murdered, before somebody is broken. There has to be something good that comes out of this trauma. It can't just ruin my life. It can't be all good, but I will not let it be all bad. I will do what I can to make sure other people are safe to some degree or another. I will still recognize my own needs. Last night, my boyfriend said something entirely innocuous, and I started bawling. And I didn't even know that what he said was going to upset me until it came out of his mouth. And I stopped and I had to write down in a notebook, why was that upsetting? If I had just sat and cried, I did sit and cry, but if I hadn't stopped to look at it and see what it was, then I may have still been carrying those feelings for a lot longer. I wish that people didn't feel so much shame when they were the victims of traumatic events. I wish that we, as a society, as people right now, were more understanding of people being triggered or upset, that it takes so much time to recover from a traumatic event, that just because you think there's been enough time doesn't mean there's been enough time for someone. There may never be enough time for somebody to get over something. I just want people to know that it's okay if it takes a long time to be okay. It's all right to take your own time to process a traumatic event and to find what your life is like after that event or that series of events, and to seek help if you need it. I want people to be able to find help, if that's an advocacy group, a religious leader, a parent, a friend, a relative. stranger online that's at least semi-reliable. I wish people had the help they needed. I hope that people can get that. I overall want people to know it's your own timeline. Trauma is complex. It hurts. It's not one and done. You won't wake up one day and be totally fixed. You're always going to carry some of it, but that doesn't mean it has to define you. That doesn't mean it gets to hold you back for the rest of your life. You need to give yourself grace.
If you or someone you know is currently in an abusive relationship, help is available, and we implore you to get the help you or your loved one deserves. Please contact the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 800-799-7233 or the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 800-273-8255 or the National Sexual Assault Hotline at 800-656-4673. Wildlife Podcast is produced, hosted, and edited by me, Brandon Pennington, with music, sound design, and additional editing by Dan Semin. Thank you for listening to this week's episode. If you'd like to support the show, you can leave us a 5-star review on Apple iTunes. And remember to like and subscribe wherever you listen to the podcast. You can also follow us on Instagram and Facebook at wild_life_podcast to stay up to date on new episodes, bonus content, or to just send a message and say hi. If you or someone you know has a story that you would like to share on the podcast, you can reach out to us directly at wildlifepod1@gmail.com. That's wildlifepod1@gmail.com. Hey guys, stick around after this brief sponsor break to hear a message about the podcast. Hey guys, if you're still listening at this point, I want to say thank you for listening to our first episode. This is the culmination of months of hard work. Dan and I both truly appreciate the support we've received from those people closest to us. I would also like to personally thank everyone that took the time to share their stories with me over the past few months. It's been incredibly inspiring to hear their stories of triumph after the trauma that they have endured. The goal of this podcast is to give survivors a voice, to remove the stigma surrounding trauma, and help those who are going through or may go through something similar find hope. We will be uploading episodes on a bi-weekly basis to wherever you're currently listening, so any support, if you can like, share, subscribe, we would absolutely appreciate it. Thank you.